Hello, it's 5 o'clock. Hundreds more police officers are being deployed on the streets of London after 4 fatal stabbings in 5 days. The Metropolitan Police says it's been a terrible few days in the capital. The total number of killings in London so far this year is 118. Well, a spike in violent crime, which is reflected in big cities across England and Wales, has reignited the debate about cuts in police numbers. The Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, has said it could take a generation to turn the tide of violent crime. Our correspondent Richard Galpin reports now from the scene of one of the latest London murders.
This is where 15-year-old Jay Hughes was fatally stabbed here in Lewisham last Thursday. There are reports that 2 men who'd been following him in a taxi jumped out and attacked him as he went to get some takeaway food. Friends have described Jay, who is also known as Jay Sewell, as loving and thoughtful. The priest at the local church showed me the candles Jay's family had lit in his memory at yesterday's service. The family in profound shock.
They're absolutely shattered. They are absolutely shattered. It is a shock for them, for the entire family, and they are equally looking for answers, just as the rest of the community is.
He used to come regularly in our shop, and we've been here 5-6 years, and we've seen him all the time. And from what I remember, he's such a lovely boy.
As well as Jay, 38-year-old Rocky Jalal was stabbed to death in Southwark on October the 31st. On the 2nd of November, 17-year-old Malcolm Maid Madariola was fatally stabbed in Clapham. And yesterday, a 22-year-old man was found with fatal stab wounds in Bromley. Of the 118 murders in London so far this year, the police say a significant number were stabbings. And today there have been renewed calls for the police to have more funding.
It's really important that we have all public agencies, councils, the NHS, social services, education, the police, working with central government to solve this problem. But ultimately, it means the government's got to invest in policing and preventative services too.
In a statement today, the Metropolitan Police described the violence as senseless, but played down the issue of funding.
It's not just a question of funding. You know, we as the police have a big role to play, but this is a collective responsibility. We are always prioritising the work we do. Tackling violence is an absolute priority for the Metropolitan Police.
But according to some politicians, this wave of violent crime, in which many young people have been killed, could persist for a generation before it's brought under control. Richard Galpin, BBC News, in South East London.
Well, a decade ago, Glasgow gained a reputation as the murder capital of Europe, but determined to tackle the city's addiction to violence, Strathclyde Police embarked on a new approach that treated violence as a disease. Now, the Scottish Violence Reduction Unit's aim was to target all forms of violent behaviour, in particular knife crime amongst young men in and around Glasgow. Crime in Scotland is now at a 42-year low. So we're going to talk to Niven Rennie, a former Chief Superintendent of Strathclyde Police, who is the director of that unit and is in Glasgow for us. And also in the studio here, I'm joined by Ira Campbell, who's Managing Director of the Marcus Lipton Community Centre in Brixton. For the last 20 years, Ira's been working to tackle the root causes of violence and is actually using that model in Glasgow to try and reduce crime in South London. So we'll talk to Ira in a moment. But to you, Niven, first of all, tell us, how have you done it in Glasgow? In simple terms, briefly, how have you managed to stem the tide of violent crime there?
Well, I think the first thing was a realisation that the police could not arrest their way out of the problem. Whilst the police have an important part to play, they're only one agency, and if you really want to tackle violence, you have to tackle it across the board. So it was a public health approach that we adopted. You treat violence like an illness, like a disease. You identify the symptoms and you find methodology to treat that, and that's involved a lot of joined-up effort.
Joined up efforts between what kind of authorities, what kind of people?
Well, it's included health, education, social services for one, but third sector organisations as well. I think Going back 10, 12 years ago, Scotland just had enough, and all of our agencies decided it was time to address the problem which had been a blight in our society for too long. And whilst we have come a long way, the job still continues. We had 59 homicides last year, which is 59 too many, and we still have a job to do.
Ira Campbell, as I was suggesting, you are using that model that they've pioneered so successfully in Glasgow.
Yeah, so we've just, for Lambeth, we've just embarked on trying to use this model to help us understand a lot more what we can do around the symptoms around youth violence. Because it's too easy just to say lock people up, as Niven has alluded to. So we are looking at how can we use housing, how can we get education, how can we get the police and parents, social services, get everybody involved in understanding and looking at some of those root causes, and what do we do about some of those root causes, because actually just arresting and then putting people through PRUs and everything else is just not the one answer. One of the biggest things for a lot of the young people that we work with is around opportunity, and that's opportunity around jobs, opportunity around seeing and being exposed to different things in their lives, rather than just the estate mentality that sometimes you get left with, or you feel that you haven't got another hope to do something different. So the idea is to use all of those models to help us understand how do we tackle youth violence.
And when you talk about youth violence, of course, a lot of these stabbings involve teenagers,
Absolutely.
Young kids, really, 14, 15 years old, and a lot of them carry knives, and a lot of them are in gangs.
Yeah, I don't. Right, so there's a bit of a slight difference on that. That actually there is quite a few people who are in gangs who carry knives, but there's also a lot of young people who are not in gangs who just get associated by just hanging around there. So it's quite easy just to say they're in a gang. There is some work to be done around how can you inspire a 14 and 15-year-old away from criminality and street life into opportunities and best kind of practices for them to get on with their lives, and that's pretty hard. So actually trying to do that takes time, and having to get young people to trust and understand what you're trying to do with them, that takes a quite long time. So Sadiq Khan today saying that it's about 10 years. I know it doesn't feel right for people, but there is a reality about some of that for long term.
Let's ask Niven Rennie about that in Glasgow, because Niven, yes, the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, saying today it could take a generation to turn the tide of violent crime in London. He too is using your model, or trying to use your model. Do you agree with him? It could take a generation?
Well, that's something we actually discussed. We came down to London last week at the first meeting of the strategic group setting up the London VRU, and it's a point that we made. Scotland didn't turn the corner overnight. You're talking about generational change. And interestingly, the latest homicide figures in Scotland show that most of the perpetrators, most of the victims, are actually around the age of 30. So we like to think that our education programme, our schools programme, has paid some dividend there in making sure that youngsters are no longer getting involved in this type of behaviour.
And you've talked about joined up thinking, getting all the various services and authorities working together on this. To what extent do you think gangs are a problem? I mean, clearly they are in London. How much have they been the root cause of the problem in Scotland?
They were the root cause of the problem that we faced 10, 13 years ago, but we paid specific attention to the gangs. My predecessors had some very innovative ways of addressing gang violence, and whilst we still have an issue in Glasgow, it's certainly not the one we faced 10, 13 years ago, and these initiatives that we tried then have borne fruit.
But when you say initiatives, I mean, how do you start to tackle gangs?
Well, we actually we went and met them face on. We had events where we invited gang members to come along, and we told them that their continued activity in gang behaviour would end up in two ways. It'd either end up in a cemetery, or they'd end up in prison. And we said to them, do you really wish to behave in that way, or would you like an alternative? And we offered them routes out of violence. And it was amazing the number of people who actually didn't want to be involved in the lifestyle that they were in, and were really looking for diversionary routes.
Ira, would that work with you in Brixton, meeting gang members face to face and saying, look, this isn't working for you, why don't you try and find a route out?
Absolutely, we use that model every day. We've been using that model for a very long time. And one of the things is around those kind of models, it is about time, and having the time to talk, challenge, keep on challenging. People relapse, starting again with them, and then moving them through all the processes. It takes a lot of time, and it is pretty hard, but that is the model of working with some of these young people. Gaining trust with young people and understanding them is very, very important. So sometimes when you even hear the word gang, that's such a subjective word. It can be used in so much different ways. A lot of the young people that we deal with, some are into criminality, but a lot of them are not in criminality. They're young people who are hanging out in the streets who may end up going into criminality through boredom or lack of opportunities, so on and so forth. So.
Okay, Ira, thank you. Niven, just a last word to you. Do you think your blueprints, which as we've been discussing has been pretty successful in Glasgow, should that be replicated around the country really? Because we are seeing, it seems, a rise in violent crime.
Well, what you see in most big city areas is very much similarities. They may express themselves in different way, but you tend to have poverty, you tend to have exclusion. And we haven't, we've taken a lot of things that have been successful in America and brought them to Scotland. There's no doubt at all it can be used elsewhere, but it would need to be adapted to the situation in the streets in a particular area that it's being used.
Yeah. Great to talk to both of you. Niven Rennie there in Glasgow and Ira Campbell here in the studio. Thank you so much for being with us. Thank you.